Podcast.
Herald and News, your news now.
The Herald and News.
Empowering the community.
Basin Views.
Herald and News, your news now. Klamath Falls, Oregon.
The Herald and News.
Podcast. Empowering the community and serving the Klamath Basin. This is the Herald and News Basin Views podcast. Greetings and welcome to Basin Views, a Herald and News podcast featuring interviews with local experts discussing issues important to the Klamath Basin. I'm Kurt Lidke with the Herald and News. This week we are joined by Scott White, Executive Director of Klamath Water Users Association, a nonprofit advocacy group that represents Klamath Reclamation Project farmers and ranchers. Water is a topic on most everyone's mind in the Klamath Basin this summer as we enter yet another drought, and to make sense of the economic and environmental implications of the water supply, or lack thereof, Scott is here. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Kurt. Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, we're going to get into all of the current issues that are going on with water. I realize it's a constantly revolving situation and evolving situation. But first of all, what is Klamath Water Users Association?
The Klamath Water Users Association is a nonprofit organization that represents farmers and ranchers, family farmers and ranchers on the Klamath Reclamation Project. We represent roughly 1,200 family farms and ranches within the project, consisting of, I believe it's 15 irrigation districts. We primarily represent folks that irrigate with water out of Upper Klamath Lake. So as some know, there's the Lost River Basin, we call the east side of the project. And then we've got the west side. The west side is primarily served by Upper Klamath Lake.
And how did you get involved with this? What's your backstory to be able to ascend to this executive director position with KWUA?
Well, by accident, honestly. I got my undergrad degree in environmental science and then went on and got my MBA beyond that. My first job out of college was with the city of Albany, Oregon. I was their biosolids manager, and frankly, I kind of got tired of working in wastewater and wanted to get into the clean water world, cleaner water world, I'll say. And so I started my career in water management with the state of Oregon's Water Resources Department up in Pendleton, Oregon. I was a well inspector. From there, I went to be the water master in the lower John Day Basin out of Condon, Oregon. And from there, I took a lateral transfer down to the Klamath Basin in 2011. And I got to regulate water rights for the first time in history in the Klamath Basin with the final order of determination that came out in 2013. And then I did that for a couple of years, and then I ended up over here at Klamath Water Users Association in 2016.
Give me an idea of the day-to-day job that the executive director of KWUA handles, the number of people you're representing, the agencies that you interact with.
Oh, boy, that's a good question. And really, the answer is that it varies from day to day, depending on the current fire, if I could characterize it as such. So lately, though, my job has been to have an ear permanently, or a phone rather, permanently attached to my ear, and just talking to people, talking through things, trying to figure out things. As folks on the ground know, or folks who read the paper know, water is a very hot topic this year. On top of a drought year, we've got injunction flows that need to go down the river. We've got lake levels that need to be met. We've got pending litigation. We've got implementation of flows resulting from litigation. We've got other litigation out there. It's a never-ending story, frankly. And so really we're just I'm dealing with the crisis of the day. Last year when we had a ton of water, it was trying to think forward to try and resolve the next issue before it became an issue. But on years like this, it really is dealing with the day-to-day operations, day-to-day emergencies, et cetera, et cetera.
So how many different agencies are involved in this? Because there's Bureau of Reclamation, there's the Klamath Tribes, which have certain water rights, KID, you guys. How many different voices are there trying to fight over water at this point?
Well, the fight over water, specifically, you're looking at the irrigators, obviously, who I represent. You've got the Bureau of Reclamation that is the decision maker. You've got the United States Fish and Wildlife Service that, their primary interest locally is with the sucker, as well as many others, but considering the day today. You've got NOAA Marine Fisheries downstream, who their primary interest is the coho in the river. You've got tribes downstream, the Klamath tribes upstream, their interests in their fisheries, their economies. You've got other NGOs, interest groups that are interested in water quality, fisheries, restoration, you name it. I mean, really, if you're interested in water in the Klamath Basin, you could have a voice today. I mean, it's really interesting how many groups there are, how many voices there are, and that creates challenges. It's also flattering too, in a sense that, our humble little basin, there is so much interest and so many eyes on the basin, and so many voices that want to be involved and I hope help the situation.
So, with so many cooks in the kitchen, how can a consensus ever be reached on important issues?
That's interesting. You say cooks in the kitchen. I have said that probably a dozen times in the last 5 days. That's a really good question and tough to answer. I think the easy answer is to say communication. We have to communicate. And if we're not communicating, then assumptions are made. And nobody assumes the best. Everybody always assumes the worst. It's human nature to assume the worst. And so when you're not communicating with people, then you start thinking that their intentions are ill-willed or they don't have the best of intentions, and that creates problems in and of itself.
To fully understand where we are now, I think it's important to take a step back, and it's always good to look at history to understand where we've been to further comprehend where we are now and where we're going. So can you kind of give me a background of the Klamath Reclamation Project in general, how that was established?
Sure. So the Reclamation Act of 1903, I believe, was passed. And basically that opened the door for projects across the West to be able to start reclaiming the land and using it for either single-use or multi-use designation. Ours was reclaimed and initiated in 1905. Construction began, I believe it was either that same year or maybe the year after. And basically, for those that don't have a good concept of the history here, if you can envision Tule Lake area and the Lower Lake National Wildlife Refuge area down there, if you know your districts, that would be Klamath Drainage District. Those were two massive lakes. So the water used to rush down in the springtime, hit Keno Reef. The reef held the water back, and it would overflow into Lower Lake and into Tule Lake. Also, you've got the Lost River system that added to that. So part of the reclamation project was to come in and drain that water off the land. So they breached Keno Reef. They built a dike. The railroad that is in the current, where it's at currently, serves as a dike. And so all that land, there's actually a drain that was dug also right through, right coming out of Lower Lake National Wildlife Refuge, that drains water back to the Klamath River. That was all reclaimed land. Then put to beneficial use by delivering water to those lands. Back in the early 1900s, there was a lottery system, mid-1900s, I should say, rather. There was a lottery system for World War veterans of both World War I and II to come in and get a homestead out in the Tule Lake areas and elsewhere. It was kind of a gift back for fighting our wars. And many of those families are still here today. Their roots run deep. And that's basically it. So we've got a pretty I mean, that's kind of the short version there, but it's a fascinating history. I think the Klamath County Museum has a great amount of information on all that stuff, if anybody's so inclined or interested to go down and read up on it. But it's pretty fascinating. But just hydrologically speaking, and I think something that's really forgotten is we actually use less water today than what naturally used to flow out to that Lower Lake and Tule Lake areas out of the Klamath River system. And so I do think that that's forgotten. It's easy to forget. I mean, you don't see it anymore, right? So, but that's basic history in a nutshell.
obviously, agriculture is a huge aspect of the economy down here, but the environment is also a very important aspect of this region. That kind of push pull between environmental protection, and we do have endangered species here that require water, and we also have farmers and ranchers that require a lot of water. How has that balance worked out? And from the irrigators side, how much water ballpark figure is used each year?
Well, I'll start with the latter question there, how much water is used, and that's obviously varies depending on the summer you have. I mean, if you have a summer of weeks on end of 100 degrees, obviously more water is going to be required. But when you have these periodic thunderstorms that drop the demand on the project, for example, last year I think we got away with 350,000 acre feet or so. Now, our maximum that we can divert on a good water year like that under the current biological opinion is 390,000 acre feet. But we had a pretty good summer last year. We didn't have, I think we hit 100 maybe just a couple of days, if that, last year. The summer before we had a drought, I remember we had like a week and a half or something like that of 100-degree temperatures. So obviously demand is higher on those types of years. Timely rainfall plays a key role. So it's hard to really say exactly how much water is going to be needed or predict how much water is going to be needed. But I would say anywhere in the mid to upper 300s is a good ballpark for how much water we use. Now, our water right, ironically, is for like 300 or 570, I think it's 570,000 acre feet or somewhere around there. So that just tells you right there alone how much effort has been done by the irrigation community over the years to be more efficient, to be more conservative with their water. Now, how does that play a role in the environmental side of things? One story that needs to get out a little bit more, in my opinion, is going back to the 90s. There were a group of growers, producers, irrigators, however you want to characterize them, that started thinking about these fisheries issues and thinking if we don't do something about this, it's going to be a problem as we're living today. So since the 90s, I would say most of this project has been really focused on trying to resolve these fisheries issues. So granted, they're not biologists. They're not. They are good stewards of the land. They want to be good stewards of the land. But at the end of the day, they just want to get dirt under their fingernails again, and not be going to meetings, not be learning about all this stuff. But they did recognize back in the 90s and some even prior to that we got to deal with this. This is an issue. So efforts have been made. Farmers have been supporting restoration efforts for fisheries, for water quality, for many, many years now. And so that's something that I think gets lost in time. People forget that. And it's really easy to point to the farmers and just say it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. Because, you look out there and, yeah, they're tilling up the earth. They're running water that could be, people think should be going downstream, but they forget that it used to be a lake out there anyway. So that kind of stuff's forgotten. All the acres that have been taken out of production in this basin, the A Canal fish screen. There are countless examples out there. Pivots, sprinklers, people being more conservative with their water. A lot of effort has been done to try and help these fisheries issues rather than hinder them or hurt them even further. And the unfortunate thing is today we look and we see the sucker population still struggling. We see this, or we hear the salmon population is still struggling, and I think it's important to recognize what agriculture has done for that and maybe start thinking of other alternatives out there that are actually going to help these fish.
Looking at history, in 2001, the basin made national news. There were bucket brigades when a severe drought hit, and we already have a drought declared for the basin, and we're predicting yet another hot summer. So when that situation happens, and we're seeing it more and more around the world, call it climate change or call it what you will, places like Johannesburg, South Africa, the capital city actually ran out of water. You don't realize what you have till it's gone sometimes, I suppose. But as drought takes effect and there's more of a fight over retaining water for this side or the other, how much more, I guess, fierce does that fight become?
I think we're living that today. I mean, the frustration is clearly out there. I mean, I'm sure you feel it just walking around town. I certainly feel it on a day-to-day basis. Tensions are high. Frustration is through the roof right now. We're continuing to fight these legal battles based on fisheries needs when all we're saying is, look, there's other alternatives out there. We've drafted sucker recovery plans. We've drafted restoration plans. And going back to 2001, for example, when the project was shut off, and of course the famed 2001 Bucket Brigade, the National Academy of Sciences came out and they basically said that the shutoff was not justified. The science wasn't there. In fact, the Academy of Sciences report pointed to the water users sucker recovery plan, I think 27 times or more. My point in saying that is there are alternatives. It just takes the community and not just agriculture to look and say, hey, agriculture isn't the bad guy. Agriculture has some good ideas. Agriculture has been surviving forever and dealing with these environmental issues forever and finding ways to live in harmony with the environment. So my point in saying that is the community as a whole, up and down the river, needs to recognize that, or I think should recognize that, and give it some credit, and maybe consider it as somewhat valid. Let's have a conversation about it rather than just say, no, you're agriculture, you're not the experts, right? Well, a lot of these guys are experts, in my opinion. Now they've been doing it since the 90s, as I mentioned before. They are experts, and they've been doing it a lot longer than some of the people who are making decisions today.
There were warning signs and there were expectations. The fact that we had such a low snowpack this past winter was really an early indication of the trouble to come. And to credit Oregon Governor Kate Brown, she declared a drought emergency very early on in the year. We've seen other politicians, as broken as some people think the Washington, D.C. political structure is at this time, we've seen bipartisan efforts with Oregon Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley, along with Congressman Greg Walden, to try to free up emergency funds to help people in the wake of the drought declaration. So what funds are there available to assist as the water starts to run out?
So back in, I want to say it was November or December, we went and talked to our congressman, Mr. Walden, and said, look, we're facing a crisis this year. We need to consider, some help. And how we looked at it was in the form of, there's obviously going to need to be some supplemental water of some sort, for example, groundwater. There are going to be people who aren't going to receive water this year and may be willing to idle their land or not irrigate this year if there's a program available to compensate them. So to the congressman's credit, along with the senators, both Merkley and Wyden's credit, they secured roughly $10 million through Reclamation's budget, the Bureau of Reclamation's budget, for such a program. We're working with a program that's gone through the OMB already, and it's in Reclamation's budget, is my understanding. So we're working with Reclamation currently to get those funds out on the ground. We're hoping to announce an official program here in the coming week or weeks, perhaps. So that money is there, and there are people struggling. And I mean, I've heard some serious, very unfortunate stories here in the past couple of weeks of folks who are already going under, and it's just, you hate to hear that stuff. This is very much needed. The commodities market isn't great right now, so people are not, they don't have a whole lot of cash reserves. They're taking out operating loans to try and get through the year, and without water, it makes it much more difficult to pay that kind of stuff back. So that's the idea, and the intent is to put a Band-Aid on this crisis that these guys are facing right now, and hopefully get through the year and pray for rain next year.
Agriculture is such an important aspect of the economy, and droughts come and go, and sometimes there's too much water, sometimes there's too little. What are we looking at roughly in terms of negative economic impact to the Klamath Basin as a result of this drought?
We haven't done the formal analysis yet, and frankly, it's hard to project that because we don't know what the rest of the summer is going to hold. But one thing we do know is there is a multiplier. So depending on farm gate sales, whether it's 1 million or 300 million, on a good year, it's like 300 million ish. The multiplier is 1.9. So you take that, whatever those sales are, multiply it by 1.9. That is the economic driver for our local economy. I'll even say regional economy. So in other words, if you make $1 farming, it's going to get spent 1.9 times in the local economy. So so wherever agriculture ends up at the end of the year, those are the impacts that are going to be experienced locally, and that's locally at your box stores, your local stores, your grocery stores, your fast food chains, you name it. Wherever money is being spent in this community, those guys are spending the same money as you and I would here locally. So,
what further steps can be taken at this point? I realize this is an evolving situation that seems to change on a weekly basis, but what perhaps is not being done now that could be done?
There's a lot being done right now. Just to preface it with that, consultation for a new biological opinion is currently occurring. Alan Mickelson with the Department of Interior, he is coming to the basin monthly to work on a comprehensive solution, long-term solution to these issues. At the end of the day, though, we're facing a short-term, immediate issue right now, and we've consistently said, if we don't get through this year, we may not be around for these longer term solutions. And in my opinion, we have to be around. We're part of the mix. Agriculture is part of the mix, no matter how you shake it. Whether it's going to be new players or existing players, I would hope that the parties would recognize that the existing players are the ones they want to have. Because I would say that the current mix, we're very reasonable. We're very forward thinking, and we want to work collaboratively to come up with a local comprehensive solution. So what can be done today? I think just consistent communication with the Bureau of Reclamation and the other fisheries parties to discuss openly what is needed and what are some real solutions that can be done today to help both the fisheries today as well as agriculture today. And if we can address those things, if we can get that out on the table, come to consensus on something like that, get through this year, that opens the door for longer term solutions and hopefully gives us some information going forward for a longer term solution.
Well, even before all of the drought talk, there was already a big fight going on related to water that has been growing for some time now, and it goes back from the very roots of the establishment of the Klamath Reclamation Project with all of the various dams that were built. Last couple of years, there's been a lot of controversy and fight over the argument of whether or not certain dams should be removed. That is now going forward. So the impact of those dams being removed on local irrigators.
Well, the 4 dams that are being proposed, to be removed, are all downstream of our storage facilities. So direct impacts to the Klamath Reclamation project is virtually minimal. Now, as you've seen in the paper, the Pacificor has lent water to help get water out into the canals for the project. Those kinds of opportunities, in theory, are going to go away if dams are removed. But at the end of the day, you look at the overall amount of water, and you look at the big picture perspective. That 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 acre feet, whatever was borrowed from Pacificor. It shouldn't even be in that. We shouldn't even be in that position to begin with. We're looking at flows having to go down to the river in excess of 100,000 acre feet. That as we just saw in my mind with the dilution flows, that was 50,000 acre feet. Didn't amount to anything. It didn't serve its purpose. So I think the bigger question is we need to really look at the science relative to the fish, relative to disease, relative to water quality, and say, what do we need to do to fix that? So we don't need to work with Pacificor to borrow water, quote unquote, and then have to pay it back at the end of the year whenever it's required to be paid back. From what we're hearing from a water quality perspective in the river is that those dams are going to improve water quality in the river. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm gonna cut off my personal opinion here relative to the dams. But if water quality does improve, in theory, less water should be required down the river. If we go back to the history that we were talking about with Kirk's Reef, or not Kirk's Reef, but Keno Reef on the Klamath River, that water used to not get over that reef. It used to flow out to Lower Lake and Tule Lake. And if you could imagine, I mean, say you have a great spring and water did get over the reef, eventually summer's going to hit and flows are going to drop and flows are not going to be in the river. I mean, I can just envision back in history before European settlement here, before dams were built, before the reef was blown. I would say very little water actually flowed in that river until further accretions downstream started coming in. But to point to the Klamath Reclamation Project and say that they're causing the problems in the river and they are also the solution, if we look back at history, absolutely not. Because there was no water to send downriver from the project. So from that perspective alone, if I go back and think of how God made this place, I could see water quality improving with the dams coming out. And if water quality improves, in theory, that's better for the fish. And in theory, there's less water going to be required in the river from the Klamath Reclamation Project, that is.
So then the dam removal isn't so much an economic impact to Klamath Basin as perhaps slightly modifying the environmental look, because it's going to change some of the reservoirs, right?
It changes Pacificor's reservoirs. So, I mean, if you like to recreate on those reservoirs, you're probably going to have a concern with it. If you're a fan of good old-fashioned American infrastructure, you're probably going to have a problem with it. I mean, I get all that. But from my role in advocating for growers and producers on the Klamath Reclamation Project, I personally don't see us getting in the way of Pacificor's decision, how that's going to help or hinder us one way or the other. And I keep my fingers crossed that water quality is going to improve and in theory, hopefully our guys are better off for it.
Well, it's impossible to predict at this point how many of those, gushing thunderstorms we may get this summer that may change the situation. But short-term future and long-term future, based on what you're seeing now, what can you predict?
Short-term future, what we're hearing is come June 1st, water is going to be available for the growers on the project. Is it too late in some cases? Yes, absolutely. But it is water that is going to start flowing for the guys out there. We don't know the overall numbers yet. The Bureau of Reclamation is working on their operations plan currently. So my hope at the end of the day is, along with this drought relief funding, it'll be enough to get guys through the year and on to next year so we can have another conversation about longer-term solutions. Now, what do those longer-term solutions look like? I don't know at this point. There was a valiant effort through the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement to try and solve those issues. Some of the parties today have a problem with that. Do we? I don't think so. I think if I look back and if the KWUA had passed, I don't see us living this issue today that we're living. However, we live today without a KWUA. In my mind, the real tragedy of the whole thing is not so much that it didn't pass, but nearly immediately after it didn't pass, we entered back into an era of litigation, and that is no good for anybody. I mean, when judges are making decisions of how water is distributed in the Klamath Basin, nobody wins, I don't think. So that's the real tragedy of the whole thing. So can we get back to a point of openly discussing and or negotiating with these other parties? Possibly. And is it going to be beneficial from a litigation standpoint? I think it has to be. That's the only way we can move forward. So long as we're suing each other it's hard to speak openly with each other. So, and that's the only real way we're going to solve this problem is if we know exactly what you're thinking and what I'm thinking, and we can come to some sort of consensus on that. So that's my hope. That's my vision. And I think we'll get there, whether it's in my career. I sure hope so. For the sake of my guys, for the sake of the fishery, for the sake of this entire watershed, we have to get there. We just have to get there.
So how can people get involved?
With the organization itself, they're more than welcome to check out our Facebook page, check out our website, KWUA.org. They can call us if they're interested in being a part of the solution. We have lots of opportunities through operations committees, PR committees. We have countless committees that people can serve on. If they just want to come and get information, they're more than welcome to come to operations meetings. We have board meetings regularly. Just call in advance. I guess without knowing how somebody may specifically want to get involved, I think that's a conversation. Just pick up the phone and call us, and we can probably find some opportunity for somebody.
Well, Scott White is the executive director of Klamath Water Users Association, someone who will be deeply involved in the ongoing water negotiations for this summer as we deal with another drought situation. I guess just think good thoughts for rain for the future, right?
Absolutely. Rain and snow is a biggie. We need a lot of snow in the wintertime. I know people start cursing it about January, February, even sometimes into March, but our guys out on the ground, it sure does solve a lot of problems when we have 130% snowpack like we had last year. But yeah, this year has just been it's been a nightmare, frankly, without that snowpack and trying to implement these court-ordered flows, and it's been terrible.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, for providing information, I guess ruining our day with this depressing information. But thank you for your insight, and we will keep a close eye on the ongoing water situation in the Klamath Basin.
Thanks a lot, Kurt. Appreciate the opportunity.